Okay, so good morning. Today is day 2 of our learning Sechet Makkot together. And we are on, obviously, with today's daf is daf Gimel, the second daf in Masechet Makkot. We are at the bottom of daf Bet Amud Bet. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So, yesterday we learned, well, first of all, our Mishnah that opened the parak noted some examples. We're talking about in the first parak, Eidim Zomim, false witnesses where they come and testify. They, of course, because all testimony has to include this information, include the location and time that's associated with what they're saying. And then other witnesses come and say, you cannot have testified to that. You were with us at that time in a different location. And so in general, we apply the punishment that that the witnesses were trying to impose on someone else on those false witnesses. But there are a few instances where we do not do that. And our Mishnah dealt with two of them. One being the situation where somebody is taking them in reverse order, where somebody is sent to Galut, where somebody says that that the accused killed someone accidentally and therefore needs to go to Galut, and so we would not send the false witnesses to Galut. And similarly, and second, where somebody says that the accused is the son of a Kohen with a divorcee. And so as a result, we will not, even if the witnesses are Kohanim, we will not treat them as if they were the child of a divorcee. We do not apply that rule to them. So we then learned a brisa yesterday that identified two additional situations. It included those two and had a total of 4 situations in which Eidim Zomim do not get the punishment that they attempted to inflict on the person they testified about. And we provided the biblical source for why these cases are exception. And the other 2 cases are that if you try to have someone sold as a Hebrew slave, a Jewish slave, because they stole something and don't have the money to pay back, we don't apply it in that situation. And when it comes to the kofar payment, if somebody's ox kills someone, and now we test these 2 witnesses that are going to be false witnesses testify that this person's ox killed somebody and it was a muad ox, and you need to pay the kofar payment, which is again, there's a machlokas about it, whether it's the value of the owner of the ox or the value of the person who was killed, but the bottom line is you need to pay that payment. And we said, because it's a kapara payment and these witnesses did not, in fact, have their own animal kill someone, they aren't subject to having to pay that. And so those were the 4 that we now have. And to those 4, Rabbi Akiva offered a 5th situation, namely where the Eidim Zomim testify against themselves. And Rashi explained that the situation is where you have the whole story. Eidim Zomim testify against somebody. Other witnesses come and say that they're Eidim Zomim, that they were with them at the time. But before, and we're talking with like a monetary situation where, as a result of, if they're trying to get Stan to pay Mark, so then as a result, those witnesses are going to need to pay to Stan the amount that they were trying to get him to pay to Mark. And so now, as a result of, but before Stan could bring them to court and force those false witnesses to pay, those witnesses run away. And now those witnesses go to another court and they admit what they've done. And so in that situation, Rabbi Akiva says that those witnesses also don't need to pay because they were never found liable to Stan. And so as a result, because they admitted it, they're not going to be liable. Now, why is that the case? That's where we're going to begin. So we pick up with the 2 dots, 3rd line from the bottom. Mishum Rabbi Akiva Amru. In the name of Rabbi Akiva, they said, again, if the witnesses testify against themselves, so then they're not going to be subject to the penalty. So my time at the Rabbi Akiva, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva? Kasavar Knasahu. Well, the answer is that he assumes that this payment is actually a knas. Although why is that? Well, and uknas ein mishalem al piatzmo, and we have a general rule that if you are potentially liable to a penalty payment, and what constitutes a penalty payment, I'll say in a moment, but in a penalty payment, then in general, if you admit it yourself, you will not be liable for that penalty payment because you admitted it yourself. It's only when others testify about you and you don't admit it that you're going to be liable for the penalty. Now, what constitutes a penalty? In general, it's any payment that is not monetarily related to the amount of damage that was done. So, for example, when the Torah says that if your ox gores and kills a slave, that you just have to pay 30 shekel no matter what, that's going to be a penalty. In addition, if you pay more and a proportion more than the damage, so then also it will be considered a knas. Now here, because Stan was never made to pay Mark, it's more than the damages that Stan really actually received. And so as a result, Rabbi Akiva would say that this is considered a penalty. And one last case that is a machlokes, we saw all the way back in during Maseches Nezikin, I'll just go to the Bavas, that we saw that when it comes to I think this was this was all the way back to Baba Kama, that when it comes to a tam ox that gores another ox, and you have to pay 50% of the value of the gored ox. So there are some opinions that say that also is only a knas and not actually a damage payment. So those were the various kinds of knas. And the bottom line is that if you admit to owing it, so then you are not going to be liable. Rabba Teda, and so Rabba says, hey, I can show you that this is really the halacha, because shaharei lo asu ma'isa, because what did these people do? They didn't do anything. The witnesses, right? We saw yesterday that this is something where there's no actual masa, and yet we're going to punish them. V'heneragin, and yet they are killed. Umishalmin, and they are required to pay. And so as a result, we see that in fact that shows that this is a penalty payment. Rav Nachman says similarly, Teda Sharei Mammon Biyad Ba'alim Umishalmin. Look, the money is still in Stan's hands. So as a result, it shows that it must be a penalty. So the Gemara immediately asks, Gimel Amud Aleph. We turn to Gimel Amud Aleph. So my nihu delo asu masa. What do you mean? What I don't understand. Let's take a top look at the top Rashi. Hi Mammon Biyad Ba'alav. Amar Rav Nachman, that when Rav Nachman says that Stan is still holding the money, Hainu delo nasa maisa, that is the same concept of no action was taken. Shadayan lo shilim, because he didn't actually pay. Elisha nigbar dino l'shalim. All they had was that they completed the law. They completed the ruling. And this highlights an important point that we may have glossed over yesterday, is that when do the second set of witnesses need to come to testify against the first witnesses and say that they are Eidim Zomim? It only works if it was after the judges in the case made their ruling, but before the ruling was enforced.
No.
So the point is that if the judges made certainly if the victim is subject to the death penalty, we are going to see that in a Mishnah in a couple of days, that the witnesses don't get penalized at all. There's a debate among the Rishonim whether that's also true in the case of a monetary payment. Certainly, Mark, if he gets the money from Stan, would have to give it back, and the court would have him give it back. But it isn't clear that whether it does not seem that and certainly this would be an evidence of that fact, that you would not need to, at least Rashi would hold, that the Edom Zomerman do not need to pay Stan if he's already paid, because again, the point is that it's only where no action was taken. So the Gemara is essentially asking, Hainu derabba. This opinion is at the end of the first line on Gimel Amud Aleph. This opinion of Nachman is just like Rabbah. There's no real difference between it. So as a result, Ema v'chein Amar Rav Nachman. So yes, you're absolutely right. It is very similar. And so as a result, we're just going to understand that when it says Amar Rav Nachman, it's not saying that this is a different viewpoint, but rather Rav Nachman made the same. Okay.
Question?
Yes.
So Rav Nachman's in Bavel. Did the baked-ins in Bavel levy kanases?
No, you're right to raise that question. They did not levy a kanas, and so as a result, that would suggest that false witnesses would not be required to pay. If that, and in fact, that does seem to be the halacha, that we treat this as well, I'm not 100% sure whether we hold like this, Rabbi Akiva, but yeah, let's keep going, and I think we'll come back to the question of whether or not we actually paskin like this statement of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so the Mishnah, having referenced Rabbi Akiva's position, the Gemara addresses an ambiguous statement by Rav, where we're going to use Rabbi Akiva's position to help explain what Rav meant. And in fact, now that this seeing that on the screen reminds me that in fact we do hold. It does appear that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva here, so that would suggest that they would not have imposed these kinds of payments in Bavel. So Rav Yehuda Rav, Eid Zomim, a single Eid Zomim, false witness that has been found to be a Zomim witness, Mishalem Lefi Chelko, he will pay according to his proportion. Okay, so my Mishalem Lefi Chelko, what exactly is meant by this statement of he's going to pay his share? If your comment is, well, look, if X and Y testify against Stan that he owes Mark $100, and then they turn out to be Edom Zomerman, each one of them is going to need to pay $50. That makes a ton of sense. But Tanina, we already learned that in a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that we'll see in a couple of days on Hey and Aleph. Mishalshin b'mamon ve'ein mishalshin b'malkos. That when it comes to a monetary payment that the false witnesses have to make, you will divide it in three, and Rashi tells us im shlosha edim hein, second line, end of the line, if there are three witnesses, so then you would divide it in three, meaning that you divide it proportionally. But when it came to the examples where now there are three witnesses that have been identified as Edom Zomerman, and they're going to get lashes, each of them gets the full 39 lashes. They don't get 40 minus 1. They don't get 1/3 of the lashes. It's not like the monetary payment where they would each be obligated to pay 1/3. And that may be the reason, by the way, that they talk about 3. They use an example of 3 because, of course, 39 Makkot are not actually divisible by 2. And so as a result, in order to simplify the language, maybe that's why they talk about 3. But Ela Kagon to Itazum. So as a result, that can't be the case. So, and maybe Ela Kagon to Itazum Chad Minayu, the Mishalim Palgadide. Maybe we're going to say that it's a situation where the two witnesses who come in to testify about X and Y, that they were with us, can't testify about Y. They don't know whether Y was with them, but they do know that X was with them. And so as a result, they've made one of the two witnesses against Stan into an Eid Zomim. And so maybe in that situation, the Eid Zomim that they've made has to pay half. So, Umi Mishalem, but no, the Gemara asks, that person, does he even pay at all? Tanya, we've got a brisa. Ein Eid Zomim Mishalem Mamon, Achi Yizumu Shneihem. You have to make both witnesses into Eidim Zomimin in order for them to have to pay the penalty associated with it. So Amar Rava, Omer Edu Sheker Hayati. Maybe it's a situation where one of them recants and admits that, hey, I lied. I was somewhere else at the time. I could not have testified to this. So Kol Kamine. So the Gemara asks about Rava's answer. Are you telling me that in fact that kind of testimony can be made once you testify? Once the person testifies, they can't change their testimony. So how can you possibly say, Rava, that we're dealing with a witness who admits to testifying falsely? You can't. Once you testify, that's it. You're done. So so as a result, we're going to say that really what Rava meant is the following. But Omer, hey, adnu v'huzamnu beveist in ploni. No, it's talking about a situation where one of the two witnesses goes to another court and says that, X goes to another court and he says, listen, I, along with Y, we were found Eidim Zomamin in our case against Stan, and I admit. And so as a result, in that situation, Rob is saying that the person who admits in court to having that happen is going to be liable to Stan, to the victim. So no, come on, Deloka Rabbi Akiva. But if that were true, if the admission were to cause somebody to be liable, that would not be like Rabbi Akiva, De'ika Rabbi Akiva, because if you want to say it's Rabbi Akiva, Ha'amar, he says, Af eno mishalem al piatzmo. You do not testify, you do not pay the Eidim Zomim penalty if you confess to being liable. So as a result, this individual, X, who chooses to testify in another court about the fact that he was found guilty of being an Eid Zomim in another court, was, would not have to pay. So Ella ba'omer hey adnu v'huzamnu beveist in ploni v'chuyevnu mamon. So you have to say one additional step. Not only when X testifies in the court in, Springfield, he says, listen, when we were in New York, we were found Eidim Zomamin, and me and Y. And not only were we found Eidim Zomamin, but then Stan took us to that court, and we were found liable to him for the damages of $100, because that was what we said Stan was going to have to pay. And so in that situation, now that that X is in Springfield, and he admits that he owes Stan the money, he's going to be liable for his half of the payment. And that's the way it is. So why would you think that is not the halacha? The Gemara implicitly asks, why, so Salkadai Kamina, I would have thought that the following is the case. Kevan de lechavre lo matzi mechayavle. X is unable to make Y liable in that court in Springfield, because in the court in Springfield, they need to hear testimony of two witnesses about this liability. So as a result, Y would not be liable for his $50. And so I might have thought that since, although X has admitted to owing effectively $50 to Stan, since his admission doesn't trigger the full liability of the set of witnesses, Ihunami lo mechayev, I might have thought that he too should not be liable. So Kamash Malan comes to teach us that in fact he is going to be liable. And so that is the statement. That's the meaning of the statement of Rav.
Oh.
Okay. So now again,
He rejected the idea that it's a kanas.
And so we accept the idea that it's a kanas, because that indeed the Gemara asks, one second, if you were to reject, because Rav statement, when we try to say that it's not like Rabbi Akiva, we say that as a question. And so the point is that we want it to be consistent with Rabbi Akiva because the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva.
So it is a kanas then.
So it is a kanas, correct.
And then but there is an opinion that a kanas, he's not mechayev, right?
When you say a kanas is not mechayev, it's not mechayev if you admit it. But here, they're not, it's only, you're not chayev to a kanas when you admit it, if the kanas has not already been imposed on you. Once the kanas has been imposed on you, it's no longer a kanas and it's just a monetary obligation. And so when you admit a monetary obligation, you have to pay the monetary obligation.
So admission converts a kanas to not being a kanas?
No, the decision of the court in New York making X and Y liable to stand for the $100 turns the kanas not into a potential kanas, but into an actual monetary liability. So once they've been found guilty and been found liable to stand, now it's no longer a kanas, now it's just a monetary liability.
Well, who determines that it's kanas? Isn't that the Beit Din in the first place?
No, the Beis Din determines whether there's liability for the kanas. Whether something is a kanas is determined by, is it based on the are you asking the person to pay more than the damages, or are you asking the person to pay some fixed number that's irrespective of the level of damages? So that's what determines whether it's whether the fine is considered, whether the amount due is considered a kanas. So here it is a kanas, but once you have been found liable for the kanas, now it doesn't make a difference anymore whether you admit it or not, because you've already been found liable by a court, and so that liability becomes a traditional monetary liability, and it's no longer a penalty.
What seems a little strange is that if there is at some point a decision, whatever it may be, that this is a kanas, and that is a judicial or jurisdiction that we've defined this as a kanas. How do we now change that definition that it's a kanas? It's no longer a kanas. Now we say that he's obligated, but he was still obligated before to the kanas. But now it's no longer a kanas because we're obligating him to pay it.
No. So let's back up a step. The kanas only has the status of a kanas until the court says you're liable for it. Once the court says that you're liable for it, it's no longer a penalty. You owe the money. The court has reached its conclusion, and you are now liable for the money. And now, post that finding of liability, admission makes no difference.
But why is a kanas not a liability? You get a parking ticket, that's a kanas, right? So you're liable for that.
No, well, because the question is first of all, there's the potential for liability, but until a court reaches a conclusion, you're not liable for anything yet. And so as a result, that's why when you admit, you have the ability to not be liable because nobody has found you liable yet. Once you've been found liable for an amount, then it's no longer a kanas, it's a liability on your balance sheet. Until it gets onto your balance sheet, until you have an obligation to pay, it is only a theoretical possibility. And then it matters whether it's a kanas, it's related to the amount, or it's reimbursement. But once you've been found liable, then it doesn't make a difference the nature of the payment. You are liable for the amount.
Well, if I look at this, like for an example, like a parking ticket. You're not liable until you actually make the payment, or
no. Well, that parking ticket is a little bit different, right? Because there's no court that's involved in determining whether the parking ticket. But if you were to say that, if we were to envision the parking ticket as only a potential liability, right? In fact, maybe let's use the parking ticket, okay? So the parking ticket, you can just pay it and you don't go to court. Well, that's essentially admitting that you did it, but we don't have. But if you go to court and say listen, I admit that I did it. And please don't penalize me. Sometimes the judge will be lenient on you. And we have in Judaism the rule that if you go into court and you say, listen, I don't want to, please have mercy on me because I admit that what I did was wrong. So yes, that would be you would not have to pay the ticket. And it's only when the court says, listen, you're liable. The witnesses showed that you actually violated the law and you were speeding. And so as a result, you are liable for the full payment. Well, now you can't say, oh, well, listen, judge, really, I admit that I did it and now make me not liable. No, that doesn't work any longer. The only time you can say, listen, judge, I didn't realize that the speed limit was what the speed limit was, etc. And I admit that what I did was wrong. And that can be of any use in trying to lower your fine is if you go into court with that admission. But once the court reaches the conclusion you're liable for this, for having violated the parking laws, so then you're not going to get out of it by saying, listen, judge, I'm really sorry that I violated the parking laws because you were trying to argue against it. All right. If you would like to discuss further, we can discuss it further after on Yontif. All right. So now the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah introduces another case where it is not simple to put on the Eidim Zomamin what they wanted to enforce on their victim. So Me'idim Anu es Ish Ploni Shegerish es Ishto. We testify about this person that he divorced his wife. And Rashi tells us, first Rashi in the Mishnah, Shegerish es Ishto Bifanenu, he divorced her in front of us. Biyom Ploni, on this particular day. V'zeh Omer, and the husband says, Lo Garashti, I never divorced her. V'ini chayiv, and I'm not liable to pay her the ksuva money, la ksuva. V'nimtzeu zomamin, and now these witnesses are found to be Eidim Zomamin. So, Bi'imanu hayitim, because based on the testimony of you were with us at that time. So, the lo nasan la ksuva, and he did not actually pay her ksuba. So now what happens? Because now technically, let's say the ksuba is $1,000.
Right.
So the two witnesses were trying to make the victim, we'll call him Victor, the victim. That's not necessarily the greatest way, but okay, fine. In any event, so he was, we're trying to make him pay $1,000 to his wife, Victoria.
If indeed he divorced her.
Because he divorced her is what they're saying. But now it turns out that he didn't divorce her, and so he's not going to be liable for that. But the theoretical possibility of them getting divorced in the future and him being liable for that amount in the future
Still exists. Absolutely.
And as a result, the amount of damage that these witnesses were trying to do is not truly $1,000. Because what happens if he dropped dead tomorrow and she gets paid the ketubah? Because that's one of the conditions of the ketubah, is that if the husband drops dead, so then she gets paid the ketubah. So there's a possibility that there's some proportional risk valued amount of the pot that he would potentially have to pay her. So v'halo bein hayom uvein lamachar sofo litein la ksuba sa. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, he's going to have to pay the ksuba. So omdim kama adam rotza litein b'ksuva so shalzo. So we figure out how much would somebody pay for the rights under this ksuba. She'im nis almana onis garsha, that if she becomes a widow or gets divorced, she'll get paid. V'im mesa, but if she dies, yirashana bala. But then her husband gets it if she dies first. So the bottom line is that there are three possible outcomes to a marriage. Either he dies first, she dies first, or they get divorced. And if he dies first or they get divorced, she gets paid. But if she dies first, he doesn't have to pay her. So the question, though, is whose rights in this situation are we buying? Are we trying to value? Are we putting ourselves in the husband's place and saying to the wife, listen, how much would I have to pay you right now so that if in fact we were to get divorced,
Right.
or I were to die first, there would be no further liability to you.
The full value of the ketubah.
Not necessarily, because what if she's in bad health? And what about the entire delay until the death or divorce? I get to the husband gets to hold it until then.
Right.
So as a result, you're not going to pay the full amount.
If she,
Right?
Right,
You're-
if she
because
has ill health.
Well,
Right.
or even if she's in good health. The
Right.
point is that she's not going to get it if the husband's in good health. She's not going to get it for a long time if they stay married. All right. So as a result, and the same for a third party who were to go to the wife and say, "Listen, I'll buy your ketubah rights." Because maybe she needs, she wants to buy her husband a present, or she needs some funds, so she sells her ketubah rights. So those ketubah rights, if some third party were to buy it, they're gonna only get it in some point down the line, and they're only gonna get it if he dies first or they get divorced. So as a result, there's some lower amount that they'd be willing to pay. The other side of it is the following. And so how much, in viewing it that way, would the liability be for the Edom Zomerman? It would be the full amount minus the amount that you would give to the wife today in order to divorce, in order to be not liable. Because that is the extra amount that the Edom Zomerman were trying to make the husband pay. Right? The difference between what the husband could pay her right now to get rid of the liability and the full liability. On the other hand, we can value it based on the husband's right. If somebody were to go to the husband, or the husband were to go to somebody and say, "Listen, here is the real estate that I have that guarantees the payment to my wife. I can sell you my rights to this real estate. And so as a result, you get to use that real estate today because it's mine all the way until the divorce or the wife's
The
death."
real estate is what's guaranteeing the ketubah.
Correct. And so the purchaser of that real estate and the rights under the ketubah of the husband is going to be liable to the wife
Correct.
based on the ketubah, if in fact the husband dies first or they get divorced.
Right.
So a person's willing to pay, Rashi explains, more than what the person would be willing to pay the wife, because the person gets the land immediately and never has to go to enforcement to try and get the land. And when you purchase the rights,
appreciation of the land,
and everything about the land and the working on the land and the fruits of the land all go to the purchaser right now. And so as a result, that is an alternative way of valuing it. And in that version, the person who pays the husband that amount would be, let's say, they are willing to pay $500 for that. So that would be the amount that the Edom Zomerman would need to pay, because the Edom Zomerman are paying the husband essentially the residual value of the risk that's associated with him keeping everything. And that, because that is what they were trying to take away from him. They were trying to take away from him the possibility of him holding onto the land forever and of him holding the land until some future time when they did get divorced or when he did die. And so as a result, that's what they're trying to do. And estimating the value of that by what somebody would pay the husband is a method of evaluating the measurement. And that's exactly what the Gemara is now going to say. So Kate said,
aren't there a few issues like the Idis or the Ziburit of the land, or the land Olev or Yored, Beshuk?
Sale, yes. Well, you're required to. I can't remember the precise details. Yes, you have to, if it's part of if it's serving as a guarantee for the woman for her ketubah, it has to be at least, I think it's Baininus, but that it has to be of certain quality, depending on the extent of the property holdings of the husband. But that does not change the methodology of the value of the estimation of the valuation of the position of the husband and the position of the wife. Okay, so the Gemara is now going to highlight these two viewpoints. So Ketzad Shamin, how do we evaluate it? So again, Rashi, in the large Rashi, that's the first Rashi in the Gemara, goes through the details that I just went through of doing the two methods of estimation. And Amar Rav Chisda Bibal, we estimate how much the husband's share is worth. And Rav Nasan Bar Oshia Amar Be'isha. No, we estimate the value of the wife's portion and we subtract that from the full amount. And that's how much the husband needs to be paid by the false witnesses. Amar Rav Papa Be'isha Ubeksubasa. And by the way, the Rav Papa modifies it. If we take a look at Rav Papa, that he agrees with Rav Natan that you evaluate it based on her on the wife's position, but you only value it based on nichse tzon barzel, things where the husband has committed in the ketubah document itself to give his wife a certain value. And so as a result, that's going to be guaranteed by property. And so as a result, that's what he's going to, and that's going to be publicly known. And so as a result, that's the limitation that Rav Papa puts on Rav Natan's position, Rav Natan Bar Oshia's position. Okay, this is some of the most complicated lines in all of Shas. And so, my apologies that we don't have time to go through it in greater detail, but that gives you the general outline of how we would value it. And, I couldn't help but think that this is sort of like the paradigmatic Gemara that highlights the role that actuaries play in society. That in fact, actuaries evaluate these kinds of questions of what is the value, what is the probability of going forward. Exactly.
Where does it mention on Tzon Barzel? Not, it could be Nechse Malug. It could be.
No. So that's what, if you take a look at Rashi on Amar of Papa Be'isha Ubeksubasa. So we can do the Rashi. So Amar of Papa, last of the medium wide lines, Amar of Papa Be'isha Shamin Kirav Natan. We do an evaluation, like Rav Natan says, based on the woman's share. Ubeketubata, but when it comes to, and it's got to be from her ketubah, lo yishalmu lo ella ha'odef. That the only thing that gets paid is the extra amount, beketubata, that's listed specifically in the ketubah. Al damim halalu, on that valuation. Aval lo nechse malug. Not Nichse Malug. Nichse Malug, right? She gets the appreciation and the depreciation, and essentially it remains hers the entire time. It's just that he gets to gets the fruit of it.
The payroll.
It does not get included in the valuation that of the wife's in the valuation of the wife's share when determining how much the Edom Zomim need to pay the husband. Okay, so the next Mishnah presents another case requiring estimation. So me'idim anu be'ish ploni shehu chayav l'chaveru elf zuz. X and Y say that the victim is liable for $1,000. Almanas litno lo mikan v'ad shloshim yom, and he has to pay that within the next 30 days. Who Omer, and he says, Mikan v'ad eser shanim. What do you mean? I do owe, the victor owes, the creditor, Craig the creditor, he owes him, Jewish Craig, I guess, owes him the $1,000, but he doesn't have to pay for another 10 years. And so as a result, how do you figure out the amount that these Edom Zomim, and now these witnesses are found to be Edom Zomim, how much do they have to pay? Because obviously it's not a full $1,000, because the guy admits he owes $1,000. It's just he doesn't owe it until 10 years from now. So omdim kama adam rotza litain, how much would a person give? Ve'yu biyado elef zuz Bein nosno mikan va'ad shloshim yom, bein nosno mikan va'ad eser shanim. What's the difference between $1,000 for 30 days and $1,000 for 10 years? How much would you be willing to pay for access to those funds for the additional 9 years and 11 months? Now, on some level, that's what interest is.
Correct.
But, and ordinarily, we do not allow payment of interest. But in this particular instance, effectively, because it's a penalty and not interest, we do allow and do have the Edom Zomim and pay. So
Why
now,
does the Gemara choose 10 years? Do we have Shviat in between, right?
oh, excellent question. The Gemara is going to get there. So excellent question. So let's take a look and see. So as you note on number 6, the sabbatical year ordinarily cancels debts. So the Gemara quotes 2 versions of a statement by Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and addresses how they relate to our Mishnah's reference to a 10-year loan. So Rav Yehuda, Shmuel, version number 1, Amalves Chaveiro Le'eser Shanim, Shvius Mishamatato, that when it comes to a 10-year debt, Shmuel says that the sabbatical year cancels it. So turn to Gimel Amabed, the Afal Gaf, the Hashta Lo Karina Be Lo Yigos. Well, 1 second, even though at the moment, namely during the 7th year, the creditor has no ability to pressure the debtor, the borrower, to pay, nonetheless, Sof Asili De Lo Yigos, in the end, it will be subject to pressure, meaning when after the full 10 years is concluded, and therefore we will say that the debt gets erased. So Masav Rav Kahana asked the question, 1 second, what about our Mishnah? Omdim kama adam rotza litain liyu elf zuz biyado, bein litain mikan va'ad shloshim yom, ubein litain mikan va'ad eser shanim. We say that the valuation, how do you determine how much the amount would be? You figure out how much you would a person would pay to be given the loan for 30 days versus how much you would have to get for the loan for 10 years. And if you say that the Shvius cancels it, well, then the Edom Zomim should pay the whole thing, because the value of $10,000 in 30 days is essentially $10,000 because we don't charge interest. And so what's the value of $10,000 in 10 years? 0, because you don't have to pay it back. So as a result, the Edom Zomim should pay the whole thing. So, Amarava, what's our Mishnah talking about? The Malva al Mashkon, where you lent the money for 10 years with collateral, or where you gave the contract to Based-in. And Rashi says, first of the narrow lines in Rashi on Gimel and Bet, who Pruzbol, we're talking about a Pruzbol, Shehitkin Hillel, that Hillel established, Shekasav Bo, that you write into a document, Musarni Lachem, Ploni Uploni, Hadayanim, I give to you the judges, Shibimakom Ploni, in this location, Shekol Chov Sheyeshli, that every obligation that I have, She'agvenu Kolzman She'erza, that I should be able to collect it whenever I want. And so that is what you give to the judges, and as a result, that's what's going to be the situation. Now, Tosfos disagrees with this interpretation, but given the time, I want to make sure that we finish the daf, but just note that that's not a universal position. Okay, so that's Tanan, and we have a Mishnah that supports this. Hamal be'es al hamashkon, v'hamos yishtar based-in, ein mashmitin, those don't get canceled with Shemitah. Now, I will note one last thing about this, is that certainly everybody would agree that this concept of Hamoser Shtorasav Levestin is the basis on which Hillel created a Pruzbol. That the idea of a Pruzbol, of allowing people to collect debts even beyond the Shemitah year, is based on this concept of putting the debt into collection through a court. Okay, so Ika Amri, that was one version of the statement by Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and Rav Kahana asked on it. But now we're going to give another version, and Rav Kahana is instead going to use our Mishnah as support for Shmuel's statement. Ikad Amri, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, and this is the way the halacha is: Hamal ve'es chaveru le'eser shanim. That if in fact you loan money for 10 years, ein shvius mishamato. The shvius does not cancel it. So again, the only time Shemitah will cancel a loan, according to the halacha as we have it here in the Gemara, is obviously in actual practice. You should talk to your local Orthodox rabbi. Is that if the loan is already due and now Shemitah comes, well, now it gets canceled. But if the loan is not due for another 20 years, so then it's not until that 20th year that you then become liable, and it's only at the Shemitah that takes place after that that you would have that loan be canceled. And even though eventually at the end of the 10 years you will be pressing the borrower for money, hashtamiya lo karinan beili lo yigos. At this moment, when it's Shemitah and we're thinking about whether or not we're going to cancel the loan, it's not a pressure situation, and therefore we're not going to cancel it. And Amar Rav Kahana, af ananami tanina, we can use our Mishnah as supports for this statement of Shmuel. Omdin kama adam rotza litain v'yu elef zuz biado. How much would a person pay to have $1,000 in his possession? Bein litain mikan ba'ad shloshim yom, ubein litain mikan ba'ad eser shanim, to increase the amount of time between 30 days and 10 years. V'i amar shvius mishaminato and mishaminato. And if you say that the shvius is going to cancel the debt, so then kulu nami bai shlume, you'd have to pay the entire amount essentially. So Amar Rava, no, it's not approved. In our Mishnah, what are we talking about? B'mal ba'al mashkon, where you lent on a collateral, and you handed over documents to the court. So as a result, that's going to show that it doesn't cancel. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Ha'omer l'chave. Okay, so now that we have these two versions, having quoted one statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel regarding Shemitah, the Gemara quotes another statement of Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Ha'omer l'chaveru al manash shelo tishamteni, that I, Shvius, I'm going to lend you money on the condition that that Shemitah does not cancel the debt, Shvius mishametet. But nonetheless, Shvius will cancel it. So Lema Kasavar Shmuel Masna al Mashakaza Batorah who we call Masna al Mashakaza Batorah to know Vatel. Maybe we should say that whenever a statement, a condition is put on something that contradicts the Torah, will ignore that contradiction, and therefore when he says that Shemitah is not going to cancel it, we're not going to have Shemitah cancel it, and we are going to allow Shemitah to cancel it because that's what the halacha is. No, but that doesn't work. Rav Amar Yesh Lo Alavona, Shmuel Amar Ein Lo Alavona. Shmuel specifically says that if I make a condition when I sell you something that you are not going to have any claim against me for price fraud, for charging more than a sixth more than the underlying within the market price, you can agree to that. You can waive it. And so as a result, the buyer would not be able to make a claim for an avana against the seller. Well, if in fact he says that kol hamasna al mashakaza b'torah tonight batal, how come that condition isn't batal? Oh. So ha'itmar Allah. So the Amar Rav Anan said about that statement, l'didim ifarshale mene d'Shmuel. Shmuel explained it to me that what is the key? You have to focus on precise language. If the person says that you have no claim against me for price fraud, well then ein lo alav na. Then the purchaser is not going to be able to make a price fraud claim against the seller. But almanasha ein bo ona. But if he makes the condition that there is no, that I'm selling it to you on the condition that there is no ona in the transaction, and meaning that the halachas of ona do not apply at all, well then hare yesh bo ona. No, that's not true. The halacha is still the halacha. You can waive financial obligations that you might have, that you might be entitled to under, or financial benefits that you might be entitled to under halacha, but you can't change the underlying halacha. And so as a result, if you're just trying to waive, well, then you can waive. But if you're trying to change the underlying halacha, well, that you can't do. So hakanami. So here too, if you use the words that it's not going to cancel on Shvius, well then, so that you are not going to cancel on Shvius, well then Ein Shvius Mishamatito. Well then it's not, the Shemitah year is not going to cancel the debt. But Almanat Shalo Tishamateni Shvius. But if you say that it's Shvius that's not going to work, that the 7th year is not going to work, well then Shvius Mishamatito. Well then Shvius is going to still take effect, because you're trying to cancel the law, and the law can't be canceled.
Oh.
Okay, so that is that's the statement. And so, having referenced a loan that is due after 30 days in our Mishnah, the Gemara quotes a brisa that notes that when no deadline is given, it is due. It's for at least 30 days. So Tana. If you lend money to somebody without specifying a due date, you can't demand your money for repayment until at least 30 days has passed. So Rabbi Bar Chana was in front of Rav, and he thought the following, and he expressed the following to Rav: I think that this makes sense. This should only be when you have a written document. The low of it inish the cause of star, Batzer mitlas and Yomin aval milva apelo. But when it comes to a written document, that makes sense to say that the person's not going to write a document if the due date is less than 30 days away. But when it comes to an oral loan, maybe a person would loan for a week without having specified. So Amar Rav says, Haki Amar Chavivi. This is what Chavivi said. Rashi tells us Chavivi is where is it? Here it is. Chavivi, that's middle of the narrow lines. Targum Shel Dodi. That is the Aramaic version of my uncle. And Rebbe Chia, Achei Aviv Haya. And Rebbe Chia was the brother of Rav's father. So Echad Hamal B'Bishtar, Ve'echad Hamal B'Alpeh. That actually it applies whether it's a written document or an oral loan. And Tanya Nami Haki, and we actually have a brisa that teaches the same thing. Hamal ve'eskaveru stam, eino rishai l'tovo pachos mishloshim yom, echad hamal ve'bishtar, ve'echad hamal ve'alpeh. So it doesn't make a difference. However, the loan is structured. You have to give 30 days if you don't specify a date, highlighting the fact that you want to try and include all the details in a contract if you can. And this is why you hire a lawyer.
Yeah.
All right. Amar le Shmuel Rav Matna. So now we get a source. Lo tetev akarayich. Don't sit down on your feet. Meaning, don't. The way I'm understanding is, don't sit down. People would sit on the ground and cross-legged, and so don't sit down all the way. Until you explain to me this teaching. Minaha milsa de amarabanan hamal ve'eskaveru stam ein rishai l'tovo pachos mishloshim yom echad hamal ve'bishtar ve'echad hamal ve'alpeh. How do we know that this? What's the source? So Amar Le, Rav Mata explains, Dixi, Karva Shnas Hasheva, Shnas Hashmita. It says that the Torah says when it comes to the ending of debts, that in the 7th year, the year of relinquishment. So when it comes close. So Mimashma Shenemar, Karva Shnas Hasheva, Eini Yodea Shehi Shnas Hashmita. Don't I know what Shnas Shmita is, that the year of relinquishment means the cancellation of debts? So why do I need to repeat the nature of the year when we talk about the 7th year? So what is that repetition essentially telling us, or unnecessary words? There is another time that we have some kind of relinquishment of obligation. The ezozo, what is that? Hamal ve'eskaveru stam. It's where one lends money without specifying a date. That you're not allowed to collect in the first 30 days. That 30 days, when we have a statement that 30 days can be like a year. Specifically, that statement is in connection with Orla, that if you plant a tree more than 30 days before the new year. So then that whole year, those 30 days, 30 plus days can count as if it's the first year of the tree, and it will only need 2 more years to finish the Orla counting. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav haposeach beis hatzavar b'Shabbos chayav chata. So now, having taught 2 statements of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, with Rav Kahana challenging the first one, the Gemara is now going to quote 2 more statements that are also challenged by Rav Kahana, but we'll only discuss the first one today. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav haposeach beis hatzavar b'Shabbos chayav chatas. That if you open up, it used to be that the shirts would have a closed opening for one's head. You wouldn't be able to put the shirt over your head because it would be sewed across, and you would open that in order to be able to wear it. So when you open that on Shabbos, that is a biblical prohibition of Rashi says of shatik and kli, of fixing a garment, effectively Makkot b'patish, the 38th of the 39 malachot, or maybe the last of the malachot, depending on how you count. And the bottom line is that you're not able to do it, and so as a result, but Maskiv la Rav Kahana asks on Rav, how can you say that you're not allowed to do it? What's the difference between this situation and the barrel, a lid of a barrel, where, because we say in Masechah Shabbos that you can take a sword and cut off the top of the barrel. So Amar Le zechibor, chibor. One is really connected, namely the shirt, and it's really totally tied up, and one is not tied, meaning they used some kind of cement around the top of the barrel, and so if you flick off the top of the barrel, so now you're there. You're recreating what was there. Obviously, this Gemara is a crucial Gemara for the whole concept of what you're allowed to open on Shabbos and what you're not allowed to open on Shabbos. General recommendation is to open everything before Shabbos, but if you have something that you need to open on Shabbos, you should ask your local posek. We will pick up from there, God willing, tomorrow, 1 hour before Mincha, in the lobby. Each of the days, I'll bring that downstairs in order to make sure that we have it.
Just does it make a difference if he's opening the shirt? Is b'mezid or b'shogeg?
Well, we're talking about a situation of b'shogeg, and he didn't.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's a korban chata.
That's why it's a korban chata.
Exactly. The korban chata. But if he did, but if he sees the shirt and he opens it, is that, what if he does b'mezid? If
he does b'mezid, it's chayav, and he was assuming he was warned, he'd be chayav misa.
Correct.
Yeah, 100%. The Gemara generally, when it talks about Shabbos, uses that chayav chata situation because it doesn't like to have any Jew violate Shabbos, and so it talks about, this is my interpretation, and as a result uses that as the method of effectively saying this is a biblical prohibition for which one would be chayav misa if one did it on purpose with warning.
Where are we meeting tomorrow?
In the lobby. It's just easiest to meet in the lobby. So we'll pick up from there, God willing, tomorrow. Look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow.
Shabbat shalom.
Chag Sameach. Moshe, we'll miss you. But God willing, we'll be back on Zoom on Chol HaMoed, and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.
We're going to be at Honors Haven in Ellenville. I'm certain that there'll be Daf Yomi there.
Okay. Enjoy. We'll miss you.